Hey, what's up you guys? It's Simon. Welcome back to my channel. So for today's video, we are doing a little bit of a story time. But before we get into the story, I wanted to do a quick bit of information about this piece. So this is the Lineart for March's Patreon. It's just a little illustration inspired by the upcoming spring solstice. I just wanted it to be very green and flowery and peaceful because this video is sort of going to be anything but peaceful. So I hope you guys enjoy, and if you'd like to get your hands on this line art, don't forget to check out my Patreon at patreon.com/SimonAESArts. The link is in the description, and while you're there, maybe take a minute to subscribe. We're almost at 600 subs, so I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who has subscribed so far, or everybody who is watching this video. I love you guys so much, and thank you for continuing to help my channel grow. It means a lot. So a story about what, you might ask? Well, today I'm going to be telling you guys a story about my absolute nightmare of a coworker. So for a little bit of backstory, about 2 years ago, I was a cashier at a grocery store, and I was working there for about 8 months before the store decided to move me over to self-checkout to help run the registers there. And this is where things immediately started to go south. So by the way, I'm sorry if this video is going to sound a bit whiny, but airplane. I'm sorry if this video sounds a bit whiny, but while I was there, these were genuinely some of the most annoying and aggravating and hurtful things I have ever experienced. So if drama is your thing, you're definitely going to enjoy this, but if it's not, feel free to tune in for next week's video, hit the notification bell so you can see it, and I will see you there. But getting into the story. So at the time, I was probably around 18 or 19 years old. I'd graduated high school and was saving up money for college. So I'm a responsible enough human being at this point, and by no means stupid. I also want y'all to keep in mind that they moved me because they thought that I was doing a really good job. So it's not as if I was incompetent. But guys, the minute I stepped into self-checkout for training, I was met with this woman. And we're going to call her Susan. Sorry to any Susans out there, but we're calling her Susan because her actual name is so generic that it is actually laughable. And normally, y'all know I like to be nice and keep things good and wholesome, and I hate making fun of people. But this lady genuinely made my life miserable for about half a year. So, the manager, my store manager, leaves me with Susan because she's meant to train me. Susan herself, however, is not a manager. She's just another cashier. She's not above me in any way, shape, or form, other than the fact that she's about in her 60s, I'd say. This will be important later on. So, I'm left with Susan, and she's immediately annoyed with my presence. We're already alone, and she stares at me and is like, well, what's up with you? And I tell her I think that she's supposed to train me, and she's again very annoyed. She starts mumbling about how she hasn't got time to be doing this and starts rushing through showing me how to clean the registers and all of the little bits and pieces that are involved with self-checkout. And it's one of the most confusing things when you first get in there is she showed me how to open the screen to replace the receipt tape. And when you first see it, it's really confusing and kind of scary and mechanical looking. It's a lot of button presses, and it genuinely looks like you're sticking your arm inside of a machine at first, and it's really scary. So I asked her to show me again because I was a little bit confused, and so she immediately starts chastising me for not paying attention, which I most definitely was. But again, it was very confusing to see for the first time ever. It's a lot different than changing receipt tape on a regular register. So, other than that, the rest of the training was sort of brief, but she pretty much spends the rest of the day acting like I'm a moron, and just is generally really tired with me. But other than that, we didn't really have any other direct issues on my first day. She was just sort of irritated with me. So, you guys might be thinking like, okay, Simon, that doesn't sound that bad, and you're right, but my dear friends, this was just the beginning. So for the next few weeks of working, I was only working with Susan, and every time I stepped into work, it was like I was on her last nerve. She was constantly mad at me for literally no reason, and at first I was like, okay, well, she's older, and this isn't exactly the most exciting or fulfilling job, so I figured I'd give her the benefit of the doubt. That is, until I made my first mistake. It was bound to happen at some point. At self-checkout, you're often manning 8 different registers and having to keep an eye on everything to make sure everything's scanning properly, making sure nothing's broken, making sure nobody's trying to avoid scanning certain items or scanning them incorrectly. There's a lot of things to keep your eye on. So eventually there was going to come a time when someone pulled one over on me and got away with something small. It happens, but Susan was livid with me. She starts chewing me out in front of loads of customers, telling me I need to pay attention better and how I need to just sit still, stay at the register, and keep my eyes focused on the screen so she can deal with everything else. She, again, was not my supervisor, not my manager. All she did was train me, and if you think that makes somebody your supervisor, you'd be wrong. Because while I was working there, I also trained people, despite making a mistake, yet I did not consider consider myself the supervisor of anybody that I trained, because I wasn't. We were all on the same level as equals. That isn't how Susan saw us, however. Thankfully, as time went on, it wasn't just me and Susan. A few others moved over to self-checkout, and I had a few friends closer to my age that I loved working with. So we'll call them Todd and Sarah. Both of them were nerds like me, and there were occasional times when all 3 of us would be working together. And pardon the expression, but all of us sort of got on like a house on fire and were great company during the hours and hours at work. Some of which were hours when we'd get virtually no customers, because a lot of us often worked in the late afternoon and into the night, or very, very early in the morning. Not only did we get on well, but all of us did our jobs really, really well. We knew how to balance work and play. We'd be in the middle of telling each other a joke, and the minute we realized something was amiss or somebody was acting sketchy, we'd stop mid-joke and sort out the situation. And if one of us messed up, we'd all have each other's back and figure out how to fix the situation. I tell you all this because Susan was also a massive jerk to Todd and Sarah. There would be times where I would be working with Susan, but also one of them. If one of us started talking, which you're clearly going to start doing at some point because you're standing in the same place all day for 8 hours, and sometimes you don't have customers. And let me just do a quick sidebar to sort of illustrate exactly how dead this store could be. So a lot of the time I would often start my shift at 7 a.m. and I would not get a customer until 9. So it be dead sometimes, and it's really hard to stay completely silent and still for 2 hours. So again, she'd always tell us to quit talking and to keep our focus on work. And let me just remind you, we can work and talk at the same time. We'd been doing this for months at this point. We've talked to each other right in front of our store manager, not just the regular manager, the store manager, and did our jobs beautifully without the manager complaining. So I have no idea what exactly made this woman think she had any right to yell at us for being human beings, because again, we're not robots. We can't just stand in the same place and not talk for hours on end. If we're doing our job and you're not our manager, what's the problem? So if you're of the belief that talking distracts you, let me say this. I see where you're coming from, but the biggest mistakes that I ever made at self-checkout were when I wasn't talking. In fact, I can't think of a single thing that went wrong while I was talking. Regardless, this wasn't the only thing that bothered us about Susan. So, the first thing that bothered me about Susan was that she was incredibly racist. She never said anything outwardly racist, but quite frequently, when a Black or Hispanic family would come through self-checkout, she'd immediately go and tell me to keep an eye on the screen before they even began ringing up their items. At first, I listened to her because she's been doing this for much longer than me, and also, if it wasn't obvious so far, she was super rude and kind of a bit scary. So I'd listen and keep an eye out, assuming she recognized these customers. But over time, I realized that nothing they ever did was wrong. They always scanned their items correctly and were incredibly polite if I noticed that they needed help. For example, like scanning the huge water bottles. They're huge packs and they're really hard to lift. So anytime I went over there to help them, they were super nice about it. There weren't any problems. But what bothered me quite a bit was when she would suspend their orders and check them out at our register, effectively rendering one of us useless to helping other customers so she could personally, or so that she could have me personally, scan these customers' items, because she was convinced that they were stealing, and more often than not, it would cause more of an issue because it meant one of us was distracted, and if something happened, it would always get blamed on me, whether I was the one checking them out or I was the one keeping an eye on all 8 registers. So, customers have literally complained about her being racist, and then she absolutely faced 0 repercussions. In fact, I saw her when I went into the store yesterday. She would also actively ignore white customers that were blatantly stealing. She got upset at me for keeping an eye on a specific customer and asking her to keep an eye on the other 7 because I suspected that she was stealing. We're not allowed to confront customers, so we genuinely had to keep a super, hawk eye on them and either have the people manning the door stop them or find a reason to suspend them and check them out for ourselves. So I asked her to do this, and she got super mad at me until she realized that the white woman that I'd supposedly been watching because I was lazy actually scanned literal hair ties for all of her items and then shoved a huge bundle of clothing, like an armful of clothing, into a bag. Every item she scanned was worth a few cents before I caught her. So, yeah, she was definitely incredibly racist, and that was horrible. So, the next thing that bothered me was sort of literally unreal, if you ask me. So, Susan had a habit of telling us when we could and couldn't go on breaks. This was something that we complained about to management over and over because at self-checkout, unless we were alone, we were in charge of when we did and didn't go to break, which was not the best idea because we were all often on the same shift, meaning our breaks and our lunches would be at the exact same time. This isn't Susan's fault, of course, but unlike me, Todd, and Sarah, who would communicate and try to find a schedule that worked comfortably for all 3 of us, Susan would just tell us that she was either going to break now or we were going to break now, regardless of whether that was something that was comfortable for us. Our breaks were broken up into 2-hour chunks, and she'd usually ask us to go to break either very early or very late, and we couldn't say no because, again, management did not manage us for breaks. We were meant to self-manage, and Susan never took no for an answer, and we can't exactly call management over a slight disagreement. They hardly came over when there was an actual problem. But that's a whole nother can of worms. Anyway, so our breaks would be all over the place, which is very stressful when you're standing for literally an entire day. She was also incredibly rude about letting us leave. Even if it was just to go to the bathroom, it was ridiculous. She acted as if she could never be left alone with all of the registers. The reason so many of us began working at the same time was because they were planning on expanding self-checkout, so they wanted people to get used to managing the registers together, not because Susan herself needed more help. But before me, Todd, and Sarah began working over there with her, she worked alone for months and potentially even years without complaining. So she was perfectly capable of being there alone. But if any of us asked to go to the bathroom or to empty our returns cart, which our returns cart was a cart that was next to us at all times for items that customers would either decide they didn't want or things that were broken or that customers had left on the registers or whatever. Basically things that needed to be taken back to the front of the store. Both things that needed done and wouldn't take long, but that she would get so annoyed if we needed to do and would often straight up tell us no. Not only would she tell us no, she would act like a literal toddler, and if you were like, okay, Susan, I'm so sorry, but I need to go to the restroom, I'll be back in less than 5 minutes, she would literally threaten to call a manager and tell us that, basically tell on us and be like, oh, Simon's leaving, Simon's going to the bathroom, what exactly were you expecting management to say? Do you expect them to tell me not to go to, am I supposed to pee on the floor? Sorry for the horrible image, but I just have no idea where she was coming from. And again, this is a 60-year-old woman acting like she's gonna tattletale on us. So it was definitely, very ridiculous. And the things we're asking her, again, obviously, weren't questions. They were statements. I'm going to the restroom. Because again, Susan was not our manager. but when you work with someone in an area like this, it's common courtesy to let someone know you'll be heading off for a bit. This was something that me, Todd, and Sarah did without question. None of us ever had a problem with how often one of us needed to leave. If someone has to pee 5 times in 20 minutes, who cares? It's not your business, because we've all had times when we work on our own. In fact, often in the morning, like I said, it's usual to be scheduled alone and left with the registers by yourself until lunch, so there was no reason for her to ever tell us no, or that she couldn't handle something like that. So, while we're on the topic of leaving our station, every cashier has very specific training that they need to complete, and that often our managers would pull us away from our station to complete, because if you didn't get them done by a certain point in time, you would be fired. So, initially, I had completed mine for my regular cashier training, but when I moved to self-checkout, it meant that I'd need to complete more of that training. I'd been at self-checkout for months, and I didn't know that there was more that I needed to do, and again, because our managers were bad at scheduling breaks for self-checkout, that meant it was our job to tell a manager when we needed to go, because they wouldn't pull us out of self-checkout for anything. So when I found out that I was incredibly behind, I told the manager that I really needed to get training done, and she was totally fine with that. So I told Susan that I needed to get back to the back to do my training, and she told me, you guessed it, no, and that if I left, she would complain to the manager about how I was never working, even though she was the only coworker that ever had a problem with me. So I'd originally thought that it was just because she was older, but no. There was another older woman that I worked with occasionally, and she was around the same age as Susan. If I had ever had a problem or I needed to step out, she'd tell me to be on my way and that she had things covered. So it was genuinely just Susan who acted like this. That very same day, she told me no, she went to lunch, and I began working with Sarah. As soon as things slowed down, I said, Sarah, I really need to do my training, and my shift is almost over. Do you mind if I just get through my training until it is over? And because, again, we were slow, and all of us had worked alone before, she had zero problem with me doing that. Especially because it was something that I needed to do in order to not literally get fired. So I did just that. The training is pretty much a bunch of quizzes on the computer and often takes a long time. And like I said before, it was the end of my shift. So I often had to pull my phone out of my pocket to make sure that my shift wasn't over, because they constantly told us that we did not get paid overtime, and if we were over, we needed to tell one of the HR people. So this will be important in a moment. So I finish my training and clock out and walk back toward the front of the store to go home. And while on my way back, I run into Sarah, who is on her way to her break, and she tells me something insane. She tells me that when Susan got back from her lunch break, she asked where I'd gone. Sarah told her I was doing my training because, again, our actual manager, told me to, and she personally didn't have a problem with it, and Susan was at lunch. So she gets mad because, again, she told me no, and then she leaves self-checkout, which she always tells us that we can't do because she can't handle being alone. But it was totally fine for her to leave. I believe Todd was then working, so it was totally fine for her to leave Todd there alone so that she could go to the surveillance room and look at the cameras, which I don't even know how they let her in there, because you're not allowed to be in there unless you're security. But apparently she went into the surveillance room and looked at the cameras of the room that I was doing my training in, and then proceeds to complain to both Sarah and management about how I'm sitting in there on my phone, probably playing games, even though HR was literally in there while I was doing my training. So, I, of course, didn't get in trouble because I was not playing games, and frankly, there's no reason Susan should have left her station to keep an eye on me when she's not my manager, and it is not her job to know where I am, especially not after an actual manager told me where I needed to be. So, this last thing was the straw that broke the camel's back and essentially caused me to quit my job. So, trigger warning, this next bit goes into detail about panic attacks, so if this is something that bothers you, please click off now. I love you. Thanks so much for watching this far, and I'll see you in the next video. So, Shortly before this occurrence, there was a night where I was working alone and I got our store screwed out of about $2,000. Something I'd already cried about, talked to management about, and was basically told that it was totally okay and that I could have lost a lot more money. It was late and I was alone, and it happens. I'd literally talked directly to the store manager and cried very profusely about how sorry I was, and again, they told me it was okay. But being a human being with anxiety, I was pretty scared to work on my own after that because $2,000 was a lot of money and I felt really guilty. So a few days later, it was a day when I wasn't really feeling my best. I was a little bit nauseous, but I didn't have any sick days left, and I figured I could stick it out with a little bit of help. And then I found out Susan was working, and I immediately knew that this was going to be a very long, very stressful day. So I immediately started getting sicker because I'd started the day feeling ill. I thought it was just that. I'm sick. But what I did not realize was that these were the very beginnings of my very first extreme panic attack. I'd had smaller ones before that had mostly consisted of just me feeling a little bit woozy, a lot of crying, but nothing extreme, nothing that prepared me for what was about to happen to me. So keep in mind that this is just after what I considered to be a very big mess up. So occasionally we'd be scheduled for short days, and this is one of Susan's short days. So she'd be leaving about 2 hours after I began my shift. And you'd think that this would be delightful news, but I realized if Susan was leaving, that could only mean two things. One, I'd be working alone, or two, I'd be working with someone. And I found out the person that I'd be working with was a newer girl. I didn't have any particular issue with her. We got along easily, as I did with most of the members of Self-Checkout, but she was quite a bit younger than me. We'll call her Amy. So Amy was a senior in high school and often would come in nearly an hour late from both her breaks and her lunches, and would regularly post photos, including of me, Todd, and Sarah, to Snapchat while she was working, as if her working was more just a game than it was an actual job. So I knew that I wasn't going to be having any actual help and that I'd be working alone at night, which was the exact shift I'd gotten scammed during. So I started feeling sicker, and I just told myself that I was sick and it was a headache and that I was somewhat stressed. But there was something just genuinely wrong with me. I kept feeling like I needed to throw up. I was spacing out, my head was pounding, and it got to the point where I was genuinely feeling lightheaded. At this point, I didn't know I was having a panic attack. I just thought I was really sick. So I told Susan that I was feeling lightheaded and that I was going to find a manager to find someone to help her because I was feeling pretty awful, and she was like, "No, if you're lightheaded, I'll call a manager." And she was trying to be really sweet about it. I figured that was totally fine as long as a manager got here. The problem was that she didn't do that at all, because after that, a friend of hers walked into self-checkout, and despite having open registers and absolutely no issues with his order whatsoever, she decided to check him out personally, which meant we'd have a few problems. Because of Susan's complaining, the store had enforced a new policy that meant that only one person was allowed to be behind the self-checkout register at a time to watch the screens and check out if necessary, and one was meant to man the floor around all of the registers. This person was me that day, and it meant that I couldn't watch the screens, and I could only trust my instinct. It also meant that I'd have to walk around and help customers scan items, help fix the machines, and try to see if people were stealing without actually being able to see anything. So all of this directly after telling her that I was really dizzy. So, despite our store policy being changed because of Susan's complaints about us talking and being distracted, she literally ignored every single other customers and checked out her friend, talking to him without looking at the screen the entire time. It got to the point where eventually she was literally standing outside of the register area, completely done checking him out, and just straight up talking to this dude while I was desperately trying to help all the customers. It didn't help that we were full on this day, so we had a person on every single register and a line all the way back to the first actual register. So Eventually, I'd had enough and was genuinely having trouble standing at this point. I know this seems dramatic, but in the moment, I was really scared. I'd never felt something like this before, so eventually I just walked up to one of our coworkers at the door and told her to please call a manager and that I wasn't feeling well. She rested me to sit at the bench and told me she'd get a manager over as quick as possible. Susan hadn't even noticed that I left and was still talking to her friend. So, hello, airplane. This is the part where if you're sensitive to panic attacks, things get a bit graphic because I do describe in detail something that happened to me, just because, again, this was like a huge thing for me, and I guess it's kind of therapeutic to talk about this. But again, if this is something you're sensitive to, please don't watch this. Click off and stay safe. And again, I will see you next week. Take care of yourself. So, eventually, I'd gotten myself to the point where I had freaked myself out and stressed and paranoid myself. I was so freaked out and stressed and paranoid that I'd started crying, which was super embarrassing, but I definitely was. I was crying and I hadn't realized I'd been hyperventilating. All I knew was that I couldn't breathe well and that it was very cold, and I was starting to notice that my lips were sort of starting to go numb. And again, I'd never hyperventilated before. So all of the side effects that come with hyperventilating, so the cold hands, the lips numbing, the jittering, things like that, I'd never experienced this before. So I couldn't exactly tell anybody what was happening. So one of the security officers kept urging me to let her call paramedics because she, no joke, was worried that I was having a heart attack, and that made me freak out more because, again, I wasn't exactly sure what was happening to me, and I also wasn't exactly sure how things with my insurance were. This is America, so ambulances and paramedics being called and all of these things, combined with the fact that this is my first job and not really understanding how these things work, I was just scared I'd somehow be causing problems. But eventually I let her call them, and they called my mom. So my mom hates this part. When she got there about the same time as the paramedics, I'd finally stopped crying, but I was freezing cold. My teeth were chattering, my lips were swollen, I couldn't close my hands at all, no matter how hard I tried. And it freaked my mom out because the EMT said the reason I couldn't was because I was experiencing something that had the word rigor in it, and my mom couldn't stop thinking about rigor mortis. They told me that I likely was not having a heart attack, but that I was definitely having a panic attack, and that I needed to calm down. While I'd stopped crying, I was still panicking, just inwardly and not breathing properly. Everyone reassured me that it was okay for me to leave and that I was safe and that my health was more important, because not only was I scared about my work situation, but through this entire situation, I was panicking because Susan had got me so worked up through her behavior that all I could think of through my panic attack was, I'm inconveniencing everyone, I'm bothering everyone, I'm making this harder, I'm being dramatic, I shouldn't be like this. What are they going to do if I leave? I'm causing problems because Susan needs help and she can't be alone. So, despite the fact that this woman did not bat an eye at the fact that I had been crying and hyperventilating a solid 5 feet away from her, as far as I know, she was still talking to the guy when I left. So, again, I'm aware this is super dramatic. So I was going to be working essentially alone with a coworker I needed to keep an eye on. It's not a big deal. But when you've got anxiety doesn't care about whether or not the situation makes sense. It only cares that you're worried, and it wants to feed on that and blow it out of proportion. And it blew it certainly out of proportion that day. What bothered me was not that I had the panic attack. What bothered me was I told her I felt like something was wrong, and she ignored me, went out of her way to not help me, and made it so that specifically I was the only one taking care of everything. And she was doing the very exact thing that she would always yell at me and berate me for doing. And then on top of that, I found out later when I was at the store getting groceries that she'd been complaining because I didn't tell her what was going on. Can you believe that? Every other person I'd ever worked with there, even after I quit, wished me luck and expressed concern and all these other sorts of things. that I definitely wasn't expecting them to, and appreciated. But I was literally not expecting this woman to have the audacity to act like I didn't specifically tell her that I was dizzy and that something was wrong. So in the end, all she cared about was doing whatever it was that she wanted and making work harder for everybody else that worked there. So that's the story of my nightmare coworker. I'm sorry this video was so long, but I had a lot to say about this lady. And to be fair, ever since quitting, I've still heard stories about this woman. In fact, somebody made a social media post with her name and her picture and everything on blast, and she still works at the store despite my coworkers. Every single one of us complained about her and how she mistreated us. Even the other older woman was like, she's so rude and spiteful for no reason. Other customers complained about her. I've had people who, after she forced me to suspend their order, would complain to me and they'd be like, listen, sweetie, I'm not doing anything wrong. This woman always comes up to me, is always mistreating me. And it was just so unreal to hear that despite all of us saying, hey, she's really maybe not the best woman to be working up here, none of us wanted her to lose her job, but she most certainly should not have been working at self-checkout when she's directly responsible for so many other people's experience at the store. She was definitely not the best person, and while I understand that the story was probably super dramatic to some of you, again, it was a super big deal for me. It was my first job, and her constant belittling of me eventually led me to my first full-scale massive panic attack. So it's just insane to see that she's still working there. I hope you guys liked this video, even though it got sort of heavy there at the end. I wish that I could tell you, like all of the other Storytime videos, that this woman got what she deserved and she was moved, or that someone punished her in some way, shape, or form, even if it was not like to the extreme, at least like good karma, I guess. I don't know. I sadly do not have that satisfactory ending for you, but what satisfactory ending I do have for you is that this experience led me to making my channel. So, I guess you could say I'm really grateful for it, because I have all of you guys, and you guys mean a whole lot to me, and I might start crying because, I don't know, you guys are just really important to me, and I never thought I'd be at this spot that I am right now, and more of you guys keep coming every day. I know I said that when I hit 500, but it's just so crazy. And yeah, I'm gonna end this video before I start crying, but I just want to know, or I want to let you guys know that you guys mean a lot to me. So thank you guys so much, and thank you to my patron Elise Thompson. You're the best. Thank you for continuing to support me every single month. At the time that this video goes up, I don't know if these products are going to be in the store yet, but I do have plans to release a lot of new stickers and prints to the store this spring, so keep your eye out on the Etsy store. It's going to be in the link in the description, as well as links to all my other social media. So thank you guys so much, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.